After I got to working on this and thinking about that sort of level, I wanted to change the title, but I feel like that's a switcheroo I shouldn't do at the 11th hour. But I want to preface it with the typical land acknowledgement, and this is something that I was new to 2 sessions ago. Somehow did not know that this was something that was done in Canada, and I love it because I live in Indianapolis, Indiana, and frequently go to the AAA baseball team here, the Pittsburgh Pirates affiliate, that are the Indianapolis Indians. And I'm like, how much longer until we change the name? And so to that end of proving it, I will say, I acknowledge that the land that I am on today is the traditional territory of the Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, and Shawnee peoples, and that Indiana statehood was dishonorable in taking this land from these native cultures and populations in generations past. And in the present, we honor with humility and gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it through the generations. We recognize the ongoing connection that the indigenous communities have to this place and their contributions to the life and culture of Indiana. Even though I do not see much representation anymore, we will give others a moment, but that's what I'm supposed to say, but I'm not going to. We're off we go. So a heartfelt salute for sure. This disclaimer is fairly boilerplate. And it's just the essence of it is we've got to protect our students and their data, and this one gets a little bit more specific towards that. And I'm not convinced that what I'm going to equip everybody with, this is my imposter syndrome kicking in. I'm not convinced that I'm going to tell you guys anything new. But the last 2 sessions were so encouraging that I actually did have something valuable to share that I'm presuming the same to be true this time. And we will get a little pragmatic later on, but I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time talking from my experience, which has been on the non-regulatory policy side for the generative AI paradigm shift that we've encountered since ChatGPT dropped. Just happened to be at the right place at the right time to get assigned an AI project with the Office of Education Technology back in late 2020, so coming up 4 years ago. And then ChatGPT drops 2 years ago while I was working for as a founding member of an organization called EdSafe. But I'm a former educator, and know good and well that oftentimes we're more spirit of the law than letter of the law when it comes to student data. But hopefully we recognize that the landscape is shifting in such a manner and moving so quickly that it sort of behooves us to think hard about the flow of data. And so whether that's in the outgoing paradigm shift, not accidentally putting on your classroom projector or smartboard student data in front of their classmates, as well as not sending things unencrypted or not sharing things with vendors that aren't somehow protected by their own encryption. And that's a very generic way to say, I think, are we all aware? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Just give me a shout. If otherwise, that one of the biggest concerns around student data has to do with the way that, the way that vendors employing artificial intelligence in their products, like for those that are legacy things that we'll talk about more in a second, they roll out an AI feature and all of a sudden we realize that they're using our data to improve their products freely. That's a big concern. It's also somewhat in parallel with the fact that we've garnered all sorts of value and productivity from tools that have been using our data for years that were offered freely to us, primarily from the Google, whatever they're calling the broad one, Google Workspace, in our particular version, Google Education Workspace. More on that in a second, but I feel like I've covered the caveat there. So today, what I want to do is focus on theory up front and then applied, but very light on the application. It's more, like I said, me giving you outlines for conducting your own leadership or following your own course of study personally first, and then socializing with peers, let alone particularly if you're an education leader and you serve school districts as school partners of OECM, that they would benefit from local experts. So my goal as facilitator in this final session is to provide you with these entry points and on-ramps to continue your learning without being too prescriptive. When I send you off today, I feel compelled to keep it at that higher level, as I said, in interest of providing a frame that has plenty of shelf life. Shelf life is everything right now because of so much that's changing so fast relative to 10 years ago. As new capabilities emerge, I want to send you off with some material to fuel your continued experimentation, progress, research, reading, to develop comfort and aptitude so that you can help others be careful. So to start, we'll spend some time on that theory, move to application. We can derail at any point and have conversations, do not hesitate to interrupt me if you feel so inclined. But if on the other end of the continuum, you just want to kick back for an hour and just see if there's anything worth keeping, totally get that too. But if it's just the 3 or 4 of us, oh, hi, Julie. If it's just the 3 or 4 of us here, I'll just start by saying, feel free to offer your name, title, and where you are in the chat so everybody knows each other if you don't already, knowing that Carrie and Karen have plenty of familiarity with each other. Not sure if you guys know Julie or not, or if she knows you. So as others show up, I'll try to remind them to do likewise. Sound good? So moving on to, wait a second, did I just cover that? So yeah, I said that. And then the thing that I was thinking about coming into this, from my experience paying attention to the GenAI phenomenon's potential impact on education and seeing early examples of that, it's not specific recommendations for certain products in ed tech or even mainstream tech that's most valuable to me right now from my experience. And I could be totally wrong about this, but I feel as though what's more imperative, and I don't see a lot of people doing this, is helping cultivate a sound disposition that precedes most of the pragmatic professional learning or training on a workflow or tool. If you think a certain way when you get that demo or you go into that training session or start to experiment with a tool on your own, I feel like the right disposition will affect that. So there are 5 factors that I see as staying evergreen for some time. The first one of which is just acknowledging the evolving landscape of data in education, I'm sorry, and shifting to being able to execute with more precision from a reliable interpretation of the data aided by generative AI. That's the thrust, is to move from, hey, we've been gathering data. We always have data accessible to us in various categories and stripes and grain sizes. And just recognizing that it's going to, I feel like, I'll use a Canadian metaphor here, the evolution of data in the landscape is going to hockey stick. At the same time, it's going to be easier, but it's going to feel kind of like being in a faster moving vehicle than you've ever been accustomed to driving in the next 5 years, is my prediction, especially given Google's announcements of both the quantum chip that they released this week, or they announced this week, as well as I'm going to show you some stuff in Gemini, or some of my work in Gemini more accurately. And then in between me saying, okay, I'm ready for this talk later today, I just thumb through the news and see that there's a new version of Gemini. And I have no idea what it can do that I'm going to say, it can't do these things yet, but that was as of like 3 p.m. today. So all that considered. The other thing I harp on a lot and have in the last 2 sessions, and you'll see this on the forthcoming slides with a little diagram, is that GenAI is a paradigm shift. It is not a trend. It is not a fad. And when we think about the things that we've encountered with paradigm shifts, this one has the potential to be more unsettling, more disorienting, and harder to feel competent with, while the technology itself is even more easier to interact with. And I think it creates a false sense of security at times, and we have to stay skeptical. I'll end with saying, reminding everybody to stay as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. Biblical quote, yes, and the most accurate one I can depict for a hardy disposition, no matter what your current post is. Yeah, and the other thing specific to this conversation today that applies to data is I want to point out that we are leaving an era. Let me I'm going to left to right since I'm facing you. That we are moving from an era of just gather data for the sake of gathering data, and maybe we'll find some meaning in it later. And that data can be coming from diverse sources and highly structured and formatted in a way that lets us analyze if we have the skills. The cool thing, much like coding students these days, realizing that they don't have to learn syntax, they can rely on, to the degree that they had to in the past, they can rely upon GenAI to give them a first draft of a piece of code, and then they can nip and tuck it when they see things that don't quite match their vision or function according to their expertise. So we're structured data, we've got plenty of it. GenAI is going to help us make more meaning out of it. I am certain of that. Thirdly, we're going to have to move beyond traditional assessments. This was my first argument out of the gate when I saw so many headlines about people concerned, education leaders concerned with large language models, particularly ChatGPT, being used as an agent to cheat. And I'm like, well, there's one thing that you can do differently, and it's going to be a lot of work, but it's overdue anyhow, and that's update your assessments. If an assessment can be executed by technology, your assessment's not designed for a human. And so thinking beyond traditional assessments is one of those things that I consider where the folks that are well accustomed to project-based or inquiry-based learning or other forms of real-world assessment or real-world learning are going to be better suited dispositionally. And the other thing of this, when we talk about moving from factor 2 to factor 3, is that we can include demographic and SEL data to create a more comprehensive understanding of each student and relate to them more personally. So it's not about you tell me, Mr. Robot, how to personalize instruction towards this student or cohort of students that are similar. It's about like give me the information to understand that I was too busy at the moment to recognize a way to personalize um, some instructional moment for a kid. Fourthly, um, I think there's just a lot of promise for GenAI to go simply beyond identifying patterns to provide educators with actionable insights to making that translation to what is the best intervention now. Working on another project, on a longitudinal data project that starts with the idea that we already have plenty of data. It's that we weren't well equipped to interpret it. And I don't have specific answers to that, except for that we're going to need more and more professional learning around what it means to interrogate data. And we'll nip at that a little bit today, but that's a growing edge for myself too. Like, how do we equip current teachers and education leaders with skills that are a little bit more every day in other professions? And you hear my pause there because I feel as though I'm saying that we don't know enough. We've known enough, and the technologies just continue to heap the data on us. Wouldn't it be great if we just had a way to like I will say a couple more times later on, is to attenuate the signal to the noise. And then lastly, this paradigm shift enables us to move towards personalized learning, like I alluded to, and tailor instruction to the students' strengths and interests in a way before, just by reminding us or prompting us. And as much as that sounds like just a teaching assistant that kept really good notes on each student, that's a fairly accurate frame, I think, for some of the tools that are entering the market. I'll hint at one, and also allude to features coming out in legacy products that are more familiar. So, any thoughts on those 5 dispositions, 5 factors that I'm thinking of? If not, I'll keep going because I know the clock is running. So to that diagram I mentioned, paradigm shifts, trends, and fads. I actually had AI make this diagram for me when I couldn't find one on my own or make one quickly enough, and I've been using it into the ground, to be honest with you. So we'll start by talking about keeping perspective against this paradigm shift. I've got some questions for us. If you guys want to unmute and answer or just chat, that's cool too. If you want to consider them rhetorical, it doesn't bother me at all. But firstly, I want to know, are you currently employing any tools for data analysis? I've seen in the last, let's call it 6 years, it become commonplace to have Microsoft Power BI, Tableau, or similar products, Looker Studio, I guess, from Google, for doing dashboards. Particularly, we've been infatuated with dashboards for a decade now. Anything like that in your current work? Julie says not right now.
No, not right now.
Okay. And Carrie, do you feel like when I say Tableau or Power BI, those business intelligence tools, that's like, yeah, I've heard of that, but I don't use it even?
No, actually, no, I haven't really heard of any of those.
Okay.
But I could see how in my role pulling some of that data in would be helpful.
For sure. I think we might be able to bypass that sooner than later. Not ask for a certain tool like that to be funded. But I feel like that business intelligence tools entered the education workspace when all of the major platforms started offering you the ability to export CSV files. And then then the next question is, okay, cool. I've got the data out of that system. What do I do with it in my spreadsheet? I can make charts, but that's tedious. So Power BI and Tableau are 2 examples of business intelligence tools that take raw data and help you visualize it easily and maybe even publish a website with it, or at very least export better graphs and charts and visualizations for presentations during staff meetings at schools or even state level reporting back to, hey, this is what's happening across the entire state. And when I think about Gen AI coming into those tools, I expect more precision and with the requisite amount of skepticism, reliability on helping us interpret the data. And so I feel like there's like this meet in the middle, like the technology is getting, as the technology gets more advanced, the road's rising up and we're all converging. So I would not recommend per se getting savvy about BI tools, but knowing what they are so that you recognize them when someone else talks about them, definitely. Because there's got to be somebody within a handshake or two that already is getting value out of those tools leading up to the present in this paradigm shift. Second question: what specifically related issues would you suspect Gen AI can assist with? A little bit of a temperature reading on the attendees. Hi, Anthony. Anything come to mind when you think about like what can, I've got this itch in the middle of my back I can't scratch. I bet artificial intelligence can do it. Are there any use cases you could suggest just so I can get a temperature reading from anybody? And if it's just like, I don't even know what you're talking about, totally get it. I'll keep an eye on the chat as I move on to the third question, which is just more like, what do you want out of this session with me today? I have thoughts, but me talking at you is possibly useful, but me listening and responding is even more so, even if it goes beyond this and I have to follow up via email, and you'll have my address on the last slide, and you will have my slides later this week, if not Monday. Okay, I'm going to keep moving on. Let's consider those rhetorical. So a few years back, I was, okay, great, Julie. All right, that helps. I will try to be mindful and not make you do any mental gymnastics. And if I say something and you're like, what was that acronym? Just like any other time, raise your hand and let me know, or fire off a question in the chat. The diagram on the screen I came up with a few years back, and I've gotten a lot of mileage out of it because it came by way of me talking to technology directors, superintendents, curriculum directors, and teachers, counselors, other support staff. When I worked for a student information system for 5 years, that ended right before COVID, when I went into consulting full time. But I recognize when I would ask people, what is it that you're using in your entire ed tech stack to run your schools or your districts, or on very few occasions, state education agencies in smaller states here. And it occurred to me that much like when I would talk to my former students, that were off in some observable way, I would put Maslow's hierarchy of needs in front of them, and much to my chagrin, discovered more often than not that they hadn't eaten a meal since lunch the prior day at school, or that they were sleeping on a different couch every night, or something like that in the urban high school I started in. And that stuck with me when I started to talk to these district leaders about their student information system, and vetting all of their questions about how our system could come underneath the one that they were going to move away from, even if reluctantly. And we'd ask other questions all the way to the classroom level. And so I started thinking about this, and that's, at least in the States, every school system has to have some major databases at the core, or the foundation of compliance, more than anything else. Staying organized is one thing, but ultimately it was about state reporting to justify the funding afforded them, and on a per student basis, according to our formula down here. And that it's their efficacy at the top. If you think about Maslow's and you're familiar with it, the top of Maslow's is about self-actualization, about creativity and synthesizing and the fun parts of life. So if you put that in a school model and talk about the technology that we use, those are the curriculum and content apps where kids get to practice skills in a cool user experience of some sort, whether that's with a screen or some manipulatable. Yeah. And then somewhere in the middle is all that interaction that happens in either a dedicated learning management system, such as Canvas or Schoology, or more recently, but 10 years old now, Google Classroom. And that there is data being accumulated at all these levels at different grain sizes, recorded by different people, and thus the values might be a little incongruent. And in a really live, elegant ed tech stack in a school district, if a teacher is working in a literacy app with a certain cohort of students, in an ideal world, anything that they put in there eventually matriculates into the grade book, and from there um, gets reported out. But it might pass through a learning management system at first, and there might be data reflection happening at any of these three tiers. And so I keep sharing this diagram because it seems like it's useful in a bunch of different applications, because it helps us organize the nature in which data flows, whether it's academic, behavioral, or beyond. So for what it's worth, think about how the tools you or colleagues use to facilitate learning, that the commonality is data that has to be interoperable in some way, shape, or form, and may involve manual touches to get it from one place to the next. And every time it does, I feel like it opens up margin for error, or lack of precision, that could in turn be the difference between an axe and a scalpel, with the interventions that we choose. Some can be very one size fits all, and we lose engagement and so forth. And if we are too blunt, and if we have more precision, we can do the least amount of damage while offering, palliative support like a doctor would with a scalpel. A little grisly. I didn't mean for it to be. I didn't expect to use the axe and scalpel metaphor, but I stuck with it. So I thought I could find a couple diagrams out there, and I did, showing some examples of how that data flows a little bit more, like an ed tech, a technology director might map out. And Miguel Gulin, if I'm saying his name correctly, he had these wonderful diagrams here, and I just use them generally to illustrate the complexity of data flow from all these different people gathering data, or creating data, to those making decisions based upon it, and everything in between. So there are plenty of these conversations going on. Maybe your colleagues do too. Does anybody recognize anything on these diagrams, or say, yeah, I kind of conceptually understand all these different data stores and the paths that they travel to serve different outcomes?
Yes.
Thank you for indulging me. I feel like we're on a precipice of getting more out of the data that affects mission, student by student, cohort by cohort, and school by school, thanks to the promise of Gen AI. And when we talk about generative AI, we're largely talking about large language models. And we interact with those such as we do with the chatbots like ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini, which I'll show you here in a little bit. Oh yeah, Gemini. And I think that's coming. But I stay skeptical, because I'm seasoned enough in my education career at this point to know that there's no silver bullet solutions, but we have a proclivity as people, as humans, to go looking for things that we can buy that would just fix everything. And yeah, that's essentially it. So when I think about the things that I'm most familiar and comfortable with, as I've said in my two prior sessions, I live and die basically in Google Workspace anymore. And I'm adding Gemini and Notebook LM to help me facilitate work. I mean, I could not have been ready for this presentation with the time I had if not for Gemini's support doing the heavy lifting on helping me put this presentation together. But that my skepticism comes forward, and sometimes I check it against other things. I'm not a Copilot or Bing Microsoft person. And it seems to me like one week to the next, different chatbots particularly are getting different accolades or criticisms on the threads that I pay attention to. Next, I'm going to mention a few other tools, as well as services and some publications too. Given Julie, I appreciate your vulnerability in the chat. I hope that some of these help extend your study beyond the next 32 minutes we have together. So specifically, I think about PowerSchool. Is PowerSchool popular in Ontario? If at all employed,
It's available.
you know what it is.
Yes.
You're familiar with. Okay, so I have this other project that I'm doing. I've got a meeting coming up with PowerSchool to see what they're doing to keep ninth graders from falling off track. And we're going to ask them to show us some of their AI features. And it's been a common practice for this other project. This is what you've done historically. Now, what can you do once you've added some AI componentry to the roadmap? And there's just four things I think about with all of these big vendors. Like PowerSchool just can't be beat. PowerSchool is the Microsoft of EdTech. Um, no matter what risks they take, no matter how many people they aggravate end users wise and end user wise, they're still going to be there. And so when I come to their website, there's four things I think about. One is that AI is everywhere, and it's the unfortunate thing is point number two I want to make about visiting their website, in that I have to think about marketing hype versus actual advances and capabilities of this technology. So having worked for an ed tech company, I know good and well that the features that we, put to the forefront and celebrated to differentiate ourselves from the competition. And the opposite seems to be happening, where everybody has to have AI somewhere on their website in ed tech, or else they may feel behind. So TBD on whether or not these new features that PowerSchool and others are rolling out are going to make the product that much better, or if they're just keeping up with the Joneses. Thirdly, well, to that end, early benefits are going to feel novel, and we will see over time if they are actually delivering. So yeah, those are the things I think about when I come to PowerSchool's website. Just slightly more skeptical about an ed tech vendor with such a large customer base and ample annual recurring revenue to invest in staying on top. They have to satisfy their stakeholders. But I think about the other end of ed tech, and that is startups that are doing some promising things in a very grassroots fashion, often by former practitioners who had an idea for a product and figured out how to get it to market. And a good friend I caught up with last week, was telling me about his product, Course Mojo, and caught me up on its evolution since he started it after another project, and gave me a quick demo of some features that are coming. I didn't sign any non-disclosure agreement. And it says so right here, it's a teaching assistant that I think on their website, they do get into talking about AI, and that chatbot on the side there is evidence of it. The thing that I really liked is he made me aware that for all the ways I think about student data in aggregate, not that EdTech caters to the district office more so than they do the classroom, but I don't remember seeing what I saw when he gave me this demo. I was accustomed to literacy apps and other tools that I used when I was a teacher, having dashboards that are like pre-grade book looking things, that I eventually had to figure out how to take what I was seeing there and translate it to the official grade book. But what I never saw was the ability to take a look at that data and, with a chatbot on the side, interrogate the data on a particular unit or lesson and see how kids that were flagged as red and at risk for not getting certain standards or concepts or chunks of content that were being covered, asking it what I can do to reach them, much like I alluded to in the introduction. So Course Mojo is an example of, I'm sure, dozens of ed tech startups that are starting from the ground up with AI at the code base and saying, how does this affect the user experience that we're designing now? Not for something that's 15 or 20 years old, like some of these legacy systems further down my pyramid that I showed you on that slide. So the top of the pyramid is always more fun. Literacy apps, math apps, science apps, they're always going to be more enjoyable to demo, to play with, and get an immediate reaction from students because of how engaging they can be. But I'm really excited about the back end side, where they help teachers say, I'm scratching my head about what I could do differently in the classroom. And I'm really happy that Course Mojo is addressing that. And it might turn into something I pay attention to when I talk to other vendors for similar product or projects like this one. And then I start thinking about beyond the ed tech, the mainstream and ed tech tools that are out there with AI in it. Boy, we sure do need some help. And one of the things I came up with, I should have made that bigger on the screen now that I look at it. But the Council of the Great City Schools down here partnered with COSIN. I don't know if anybody's familiar with COSIN. I can't even remember. It's something what the C and the O stand for, but school networking. So they have a dated name, but they are leaning heavy into helping people with AI be a whole lot more responsible with their checklist, and wanted to make sure that anybody attending tonight knew that that their AI readiness checklist is a pretty valuable tool. So, oh, that's why I had a duplicate slide. All right. I had a nice little quote on this one too. But I would start making lists of these resources regardless of what country they come from. There's a lot of great material that came from Europe before the United States got their things published. And I'm certain Canada, even though I'm not familiar with those guidance documents, publications or websites, has something similar. Well, I have all sorts of duplicate slides in there somehow. All right, skipping ahead. I don't think you could see the difference, but those were, the same slide over and over. And then as I think about what CoSN has done, particularly for tech directors and with an emphasis on security about data, also thinking about socializing AI literacy across the board. Is there any efforts amongst the attendees here, Anthony, Carrie, Julie, and Karen, on bolstering AI literacy? And could you give me any examples? If so, but if not, I'm going to direct you towards this resource. I can't tell if people are typing or not. All right, so Digital Promise, great organization, a client of mine I do work with. I've doing this other project, ninth grade, keeping ninth graders on track with data we already have, in conjunction with the Gates Foundation, and was working on several other publications I'll mention in a moment while this was coming out. And I was super happy that they put this out, primarily because it's from Digital Promise and the learning scientists that I know and respect there. So I know it's a good baseline, and it's easy to find Digital Promise AI literacy framework. And I'll try to include that in my follow-up email. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention ALP, since I am here on behalf of ALP. What I love about this crew is that we're all former practitioners, and we've worked with a bunch of different school systems of various sizes and to solve a bunch of different problems. I think I'm in my third year with them, and I'm a part of their GenAI executive consulting team, and why I'm with you tonight. But there are tons of other resources, and more so, it's the people. Whether it's Dean Sharesky that you're familiar with, or plenty of his other teammates there at ALP, this organization has really rallied and focused and come up with some very useful tools that are within their wheelhouse. So leaning on ALP for further work beyond this webinar series, I can't recommend it enough. And then I think about all the things that I read that are out there that come around periodically. I still can't help not setting Google alerts for AI and education news, and at least just scanning to see what's happening out there, whether that's some problem or some innovation. I want to know. And just 5-6 days ago, Jeffrey over at EdSurge published a very timely article that I stumbled across earlier today. And it's a very high level, it's journalism. It's not intended to be academic at all. But these are the ways I try to keep my thumb on the pulse is by reading not just the big published documents and reports and papers internationally, but also staying on top of what the press is saying. And whether it's EdWeek or EdSurge down here in the States, I think they're all aware that there's an audience looking for answers. So keeping tabs on those, setting alerts, or subscribing to newsletters, highly recommended. One more, we'll jump back up to that non-policy, to the non-regulatory policy side of things. I'm pretty proud of the series of documents I got to contribute to over the last couple of years through the U.S. Department of Education, rest in peace. The Office of Education Technology, good friends of mine, going back several years now, working together and trying to shine a light on what this might do to impact the profession. And the Education Leaders Guide, which was the last of them, is a pretty good read, and a valuable resource to share or to download and to pump into Gemini or Notebook LM and say, can you just distill this down to some talking points for my next staff meeting? Highly encourage you checking out the Office of Educational Technology's publications on artificial intelligence. Okay, we are moving. Oh man, we're running out of time already. How's this possible? So I'll pick up the pace. What I want to say is that I feel like there are 5 factors for establishing a disposition. The evolving landscape of data and education, which we have covered. Wait a second, is this a duplicate? And how did this get in there? And I'm going to skip. Pardon my roughness. But what it led me to thinking about was how to rethink student data in the age of Gen AI. And I think about how several things come to mind. I'm just going to bring them all up for you. We've got to get beyond the numbers. Pardon, I got lost in my tabs there for a second. We got to get beyond the numbers. And I'm asking you to reflect for a second on this. I've got a little prompt question for you there in italics for each of these 4 points, but for brevity's sake, we'll keep moving. The power of context is also another major factor, um, to think about what it is that we're trying to accomplish and what we're bringing into it data-wise to form a fuller picture of the situation. Sometimes we don't need it, and we shouldn't over engineer how we use data to affect interventions. But to some point, I feel as though we could do a better job of not shooting from the hip and being anecdotal and keeping that the context of an entire student's performance in hand, like I mentioned from my own practice. And it's not enough to move to just get insights. We have to move to action, and I want to continue to presume that Gen AI is going to help us be more precise. Lastly, and back to the disclaimers up front, we have to have the ethical considerations and be knowledgeable about the ways that our data is being used, let alone how models and tools that we're using were trained in the first place. I feel like there's been a lot said about this and published, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. But if you just look up Gen AI ethics and education, there should be plenty of great thoughts out there. The summary is we have to be careful and cognizant and aware. And if you follow the Digital Promise AI literacy guide, I think you'll have the vernacular to approach vendors or colleagues and say, are we doing the right thing with the right tools right now? But then if you take all of that background and apply it towards assessing student data, I have some questions or some thoughts for the question of like, how would we use Gen AI and what could that look like in sort of a framework that would be somewhat evergreen? And so I think about that diagram I showed you and the nature of comprehensive data collection coming from all these different sources, and some are objective and some are not. Is it possible where we could get a little bit of support marrying the two and coming out with solutions that work better? And the biggest thing is using AI to do what computers are best at. It's silly not to use a calculator for certain things, but we also still can, hopefully calculate a tip at a restaurant without using a calculator. No judgment if you have to, though. I get that. So recognizing the patterns and trends and doing it in an efficient way is one of the biggest reasons for investing in learning these tools and developing these skills, but not at the expense of taking humans out of the loop, something we talk about exclusively in those Office of Education Technology publications. So staying skeptical, staying shrewd. Hey, this is what the outcome is we went through this process. We fed this tool a bunch of data. It's summarizing it thusly. It's suggesting some next steps. Still, are these right? And to sit down in a PLC and discuss it and say, hey, this is what we came up with. How do we feel about it? What changes will we make from the draft that the Gen AI did so efficiently analyzing the data? And then like to actually get good at translating that into the most personalized manner possible. And this might even apply to planning PD. We don't, there's a part of me that's like listening to this talk right now going, nobody likes to be talked at, but it's sort of the nature of what we all signed up for tonight. Still, I know good and well that when we sit down and we try to personalize things, it means like making it more interactive, drawing students and adults into the material earlier than just lecturing. And then not forsaking the continuous evaluation, continually checking and saying, hey, we can't just rinse and repeat this without a quick pre-flight check to make sure it's the same workflow for this period, this grading period, this period of the day, this grading period, this semester, this school year, district-wide and beyond. And then, oh, my slides quit responding. And my slides are just not advancing all of a sudden. Let's see if that does it. Okay, there we go. I don't know what that, okay. So a few minutes of getting theoretical and I'll blaze through this, I promise. Again, you can review all this later. But those things that I think about with that disposition and background that I just led us to is the idea of thinking about how do we use Gen AI to inform data, the legacy data-driven decision-making that was already a part of our culture. Are we aware of the limitations and the opportunities when we shift to a new paradigm and include new tools? Again, the ethical considerations and responsible use of AI. And then, pardon me, this is my slide deck's freezing. Huh, all right. Okay. Maybe I'm just being hasty. That's what's happening. I'm just clicking too fast. Okay. All right. So when we talk about data, so let's break each of these three things down. Data-driven decision-making in the age of AI with your team. I think what's important is that everybody understands a common definition of data-driven decision-making and that it's cyclical. It's not one and done. I think it's important to also highlight for everybody how GenAI enhances each stage of that cycle and to look for opportunities to ask, is there something that we could do differently than we did before we started using these tools at each juncture? And what are the actual gains across that entire cycle, whether it's efficiency or more precision? And then thirdly, when I failed to mention that when I was talking to you about Course Mojo, something that Eric, the founder, told me that was really interesting is that we're moving from an era of simply structured data to having a layer of interpretation that's just never been afforded to us before, and that it can give us a more holistic view of the student, given the disparate the diversity of the data sources we're able to feed into it that may have been too beyond our technical capabilities to do across the different data stores in that early diagram, whether it's the SIS, the LMS, a classroom level tool gathering student assessment data. So when we think about that and move on to limitations and opportunities to your team, I'm going to show you what AI can and can't do in a few slides. But I think about acknowledging the challenges of traditional data and thinking analysis and thinking about like how much is it worth for this person to sit and concatenate all these spreadsheets on their own when they're supposed to be doing something else, or whether that's a classroom teacher or a school data coordinator, a district data coordinator. And that we need to learn how to frame these challenges as opportunities for GenAI to provide solutions. So there might be some things that we've wanted to do in the past that we can revisit and say, hey, now we can do this. We always thought if we only had a way to put A and B together, but lacked the ability to do it with our current vendors, or you're locked into a contract and you're not going to switch because it's an enterprise grade solution, or it involves hiring it out and the budget associated with it. We could probably do these things in-house now if we're aware of the limitations as well as the opportunities. And then, like in section 3, what you'll talk about, like if you do use this with others to train them, how to start down this pathway and make some mistakes and safely make some mistakes using these tools with some sample student data before using it in the wild for real. Nice little quote here. Across the grades, when instruction was challenging, relevant, and academically demanding, then all students had higher engagement, and teachers talked less, and the greatest beneficiaries were at-risk students. And I included this here to say that there's not really any reason to change things unless we're considering the least among us. Like those students that it might slip through the cracks if things get too complex. And I think it behooves us to use technology to make learning easy, the learning experience easier, more accessible. That was a John Hattie quote. Next slide. Come on now. And then thirdly, we talk about those ethical considerations here. A few bullets to think about that. It's important to socialize amongst everybody that you work with that might be using AI, how to use it, with some of the biggest concerns being surfaced by organizations out there that are really focused on ethics, privacy, fairness, accountability, transparency, safety, accountability, fairness, and efficacy is another frame from the safe crew. And then keeping that human in the loop, but even applied to ethics and asking, are we certain that the model wasn't trained on data that is not that is representative of all the people that we are trying to teach and reach, and then figuring out ways to link it to practical applications in order to use AI ethically and effectively, no matter what the data analysis is. And John Dewey reminds us that we have to change. We have to. The older I get, the harder this is for me to continue to preach. Okay. So that's a little bit of theoretical background. And with the remaining few minutes, I'm just going to cover a very practical application. And I want to say this, if you didn't attend my first 2 sessions, they are recorded and available. And I spend a little bit more time actually demonstrating Google Gemini and Notebook LM. I'm going to show you a couple screenshots here. I'm going to make it super simple because I want this to be something that you are encouraged to play with. So I'm going to set this, and again, for you to repeat for others. So like setting the stage, showing them a hands-on with Gemini and Notebook, for example. But if you're using Microsoft Copilot, Bing, and Excel, I think it still works. And then figuring out a disposition, your dispositional stance for going beyond the basics. Okay, the space bar works. That's what I just figured out. The right arrow button is not. Okay. So when we set the stage for our team, I think there's several things that are really important to do in a train the trainer kind of focus, and that's to reiterate the application objective, what it is that we're going to do. In this section, we'll equip you with the knowledge and skills to use GenAI for your own data analysis, but also to guide your colleagues in leveraging these powerful tools, a talking point such as that. And then if you're training other people or you yourself aren't familiar with Google Sheets, I alluded to my prior sessions on that. And just an overview, a familiarity session with these new tools, these new AI infused tools, because they're standalone, but Gemini is available in every Google product right now. And I have to think that Copilot is too, even though I'm not a user. I suspect that to be true. So I want to show you a simpler version of that crazy diagram that I put up earlier. If we just narrow it down, there are only three phases. There is the collection of student data in something like a student information system or a learning management system or a particular curriculum app, and maybe it's one that's used across the entire English department, for example. But point being that there's a data store somewhere that likely has the ability for you to extract that data as a flat file, as a comma separated value file that you can open in your favorite spreadsheet. I prefer Google Sheets. And that from there, I can activate Gemini from within Google Sheets, or I could go to Gemini directly and get what I'm looking at, get what I'm looking for started, and then I can take it over to Notebook LM or some other tool and get even more. So this idea of just three things here should simplify it. But if you remember the prior diagram, each of these three have variations in between. So a store, a management tool, and an interaction with a chatbot. And I expect this to all change, but it's important to remember that no matter how much experimenting that we do, if we're not coming up with interventions that promote mission, it's just we're repeating the same tech infatuation that we've always had. So setting the stage, let's fly through this. I'm just gonna zip ahead. I know where I want to be. So some talking points here about those three phases, but let me just cut to it because I want to save a couple minutes for discussion here. But it's just I'm fleshing out what I described, a couple sample activities here, but I'm just going to jump to showing you if I can get the slides to work to advance. There, okay. Everybody seeing the spreadsheet? I think so. My secondary monitor here. Okay, so I took a sample of student data and I studied it for a few minutes in Sheets to understand like what the scope was. And it was mostly demographic, but there are some grades in it. And it felt like a very rudimentary student information system report back to my early days of teaching and the system that we were using. And then in the upper right-hand corner by my little face icon up there, in the upper right under the browser bar, in between the share button and my face, there's the Gemini button. I have Gemini activated. It's $17 a month. And I'm enjoying what it's helping me accomplish. And it's well worth the $17 a month right now. But I came at it headstrong that I could just look at this data and ask it for students who are at risk of not passing, in their language arts grade. And it told me it couldn't. And I was like, oh, well, I just ran into a limitation that I really didn't expect. It kind of surprises me. But instead of being wholesale just done with that, I paused and I noticed that it was telling me what it could do. And one of the things it did was say, what I can do within Google Sheets is I can help you create a formula that solves something like figuring out the mean, the average of a student on a particular column of data, like I have highlighted here, which is not night and day, but I couldn't difference from the way it was before, but it would take me forever to figure out the formula to get to a certain results, or I would be stuck with the skills that I brought with me and only be able to do an average, only be able to do a total, things like that. If you have broader spreadsheet skills, this example is going to feel extremely rudimentary, but what I loved is that it got me thinking about what I could do next. And there are other prompts here in the sidebar within Google Sheets that were interesting, but I wanted to go big. And so I decided to bump it to Notebook LM and see what it can do to interpret the data. And I get over there and I ran into a similar frustration. I discovered that I could not I could link to other Google documents, slides, and docs, but I couldn't link to a Google Sheet yet. So immediately that plants in me this expectation that soon I will be able to. I bet that they add the Google Sheets function next to it, and then I can just have Notebook run headlong at Google Sheets that all I had to do was import from wherever I extracted them from. So I loaded this guy in here by exporting it first as a PDF. So I figured out I could, since it accepts PDFs and I knew Google Sheets let me save out an exported version of a table as a PDF. I don't get it, but it worked. So I threw that in there, and without me prompting it, it gave me that summary that you're seeing there, explaining it and offering me some initial insights voluntarily. But the thing that I really like is that because Notebook LM is more academically focused, I could further interrogate it. It gives me some suggested questions, or I can start to do my own if I close this window and just go into the little chat entry box. Then the other thing that I loved about this was I put myself in the position as an education leader, and I thought to myself, if I was looking at this data as like, say, maybe a curriculum director and wanted to share some of this out with my teachers, I might go so far as to use Notebook LM's native tools to conjure up some study materials, as you see in the upper left portion of that of my slide, from an FAQ to a study guide, and on the right side, like to actually create a podcast. I talk about that in my last session, but I didn't think about it in terms of interpreting student data. And as an education leader, having it help me plan the next staff meeting around, ahead of a high stakes testing window, for example. So I thought this could be great, if only to start conversations with the humans in the room, but it takes very little effort to leverage the technology to get there on your own. So very, very rudimentary example of that, based on what time we have, but also what time I had prior to this. And it's just leaving me with more curiosity to see what I can do with other data sets. Not working for a school district anymore. I don't have that. That's not front of mind for me as much as it used to be. So that considering, I'm going to leave us with some understandings here of what is possible with these tools, much like I alluded to there. So from analyzing diverse data sources and identifying patterns and trends, generating summaries and reports I just demonstrated, and eventually getting to the point of personalized insights when I prompt it to give me some interventions. And then it makes me think about, well, what's not possible yet? I just ran into a few examples, and oh yes, and to facilitate collaboration. I ran into a few examples of what is not possible. I swear, I'm advancing the slides and nothing's happening. Manually switch to slide 35. Does that work? All right. And then, so thinking about what's not possible besides my acute examples, I think about how it's not going to replace my human judgment. The example I always give is the episode of The Office where Michael Scott's driving down the boat ramp following Google Maps directions, literally, and not using his eyes and his senses, other senses, to interpret that, you know what, the technology is not right. So I think it's super important when we think about particular ways that students can be harmed if we interpret data incorrectly and we put them in the wrong place at the wrong time. Secondly, when it does come to perfect accuracy, I not to have to do the math again, but we have to develop ways where we can interpret the outcomes, especially if they're quantitative, and make certain that what they're doing is right. I would predict higher accuracy than that, but these are large language models that can do math. They're not computational models that can speak humanely. And then I can't not talk about the ethics. We have to, at least in this first era of the new paradigm shift, we have to continue to presume that capitalist motivations aren't aligned with educational ones at all times. And but if we can end up with some real-time interventions to not lose a student, particularly, or even a teacher in professional learning, it's worth having that. And the other thing I'm really excited about, but I don't really know yet, except anecdotally, is understanding student behavior. And a friend of mine who's in technology and works exclusively daily in AI development said on the personal side, ChatGPT helped him have more civil conversations with his daughter after years of developing patterns that were less than ideal. And I can't think of a better application of technology helping people than fortifying relationships and clearing lines of communications. So imagine that with students that you've not been able to reach, and figuring out some way for them to express themselves, or for you to have things to express that were supported by just the sheer ton of data that these models are built upon. Oh, we are over time. And my slides are still not working. So the last thing I want to remind you about that is, like, your results might vary, but I want to know what you're thinking now. After letting me run my mouth for about an hour on some of these high level things with very little actually pragmatic. Thanks, Julie. Anybody have any thoughts? I know we're over time, but anybody have any thoughts or questions?
No, I just think there's a lot of potential to be able to analyze the data that we have access to in different ways and quickly, as
Yeah.
opposed to, you know, going over it, and comparing,
Yeah.
and yeah,
The
it's
fine
just a lot of potential.
the fine-tooth comb work is what I'm most excited about leaving behind. It's in exchange for being skeptical, but it's no different than asking a student, you did this, you wrote this.
Mhm.
You're asking the chatbot, are you sure? Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a ton of potential, and this is just the beginning. I used to say about the software, the student information system I was selling. This is when I demo it. I'd see everybody impressed, and I'm like, hang tight. This is the worst version of this software you'll ever see. We release a new version every 2 weeks, and by the time you use it next fall, it's going to be even better. I just hope that that greed doesn't get in the way of mission. Greed by the developers, mostly mainstream, not so much ed tech, but kind of. Okay. Well, if that's all, I hope this was helpful in some way. Like I said, I will follow up with an email with these slides. I'm going to do another pass and give you links to those resources that I mentioned, so you don't have to go dig them up yourself. You're welcome, Carrie. You're welcome, Karen. I wish you all the best, and thank you so much for taking time with me tonight.